And I guess it helps for me to turn on the microphone. That's why this poll is run, so I can remember to do that. Okay, looks like everybody can hear now. So this is going to be, I presume, our last class. Not 100% sure, but I think I can get through everything we need to get through today. What we're going to do is basically go over an outline for the essay response that you're going to sculpt for your final exam. And I have an outline that is posted up in Blackboard for you. And first thing I'm going to do is navigate in there so you can see that on the screen and see where it's located. I'm going to start by clicking our lessons link. And then I'm going to scroll down to the very last folder, which is the final exam. And then I think I've actually uploaded this before. You see it right there at the top. Click on that. That's going to open outside of Blackboard. So I'm going to have to come back and switch over to it. But that's so that you know where it is. And then I will come back over and I will switch over to it in just a second. This outline covers a few things that we haven't gotten to yet, but there's only a couple. And so what I will do is I'll go through the outline, and then when we get down towards the end and we get to the newer stuff, we'll take a look at that a little bit more closely so I can kind of both do the parts where I would go over it in class and kind of fit it into this review at the same time. Okay, so this sometimes doesn't work, at least not right off, but it looks like it did this time. All right. Basically, this is just like it says, it's an outline. You can see as I scroll through it that it is rather extensive. As I mentioned, I would expect that your response is going to be at least a paragraph for each of those Roman numerals. Some of those, such as this last one, you see that there's an A and a B, and they've got quite a bit under them. So I would expect some of these you might actually have 2 paragraphs on. Right? But you want to be as thorough as possible. Again, you could have been writing this up this whole time. If you've been taking your notes, either like in a narrative format, so you already got the sentences worked out, you could just weave those straight in, or if you've just been taking like bullet type point notes and taking down the facts, it should be pretty easy for you to turn those into sentences and string them into paragraphs, and should make this a lot easier for you, even though it is longer, right? Okay. First off, we don't have to go back to the colonial stuff. The exam question does ask about slavery in the United States up to the Civil War, right? Specifically, you want to look at the impact that westward expansion had on the sectional rivalries and the debates on slavery in the U.S., right? Again, up to the Civil War. And so we don't really have to do the colonial phase because there is no United States until we get done with the revolution, or actually in the midst of the revolution, I should say. Right. All right, first thing you want to talk about is that Northwest Ordinance. You want to, again, focus on a few things. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to let you fill in most of the details, but I'll give you a little bit on this first one especially. A Northwest Ordinance basically bans slavery in the Northwest Territory, what would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc. So that creates that first divide between North and South on the basis of free and slave, right? And you can mention quite a bit about this. There's some things you could get in there. So you could mention Southern attitudes might be in at least some Southerners are inclined to think slavery is going to die out. Hence, some people credit this to Thomas Jefferson and so forth. But really, what you're looking for is that discussion about how it creates that division, right? The next is this drafting of the Constitution, and you want to probably devote a sentence to at least these 3 things. I would say the last one you might actually get 2 sentences in on 3/5 compromise, but basically this should be about a paragraph as well. And it mentions, slavery is never mentioned. It uses the phrase involuntary servitude. You want to look at the slave trade and fugitive slaves provisions in there, those 2 compromises. If you forgot those, basically, it prevented the federal government from banning the slave trade until at least 1808. It required other states to give up escaped slaves to be returned back to whatever slave state that they came from. Right? Really, the core of it, though, the one that you really want to focus in is that 3/5 compromise, and that's going to be crucial to the divide. You want to understand how that allows the South to have more power in both the Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, and in the Electoral College when a president is chosen, and how that also affects that sectional rivalry between North and South, right? We're going to skip over to the War of 1812. And again, this is one that you want to mention. Don't devote a whole time to it. You want to note, it references Canada there, basically that there is a desire to acquire it. There's a war hawks are trying to acquire additional land for settlement. Canada would never likely be slave territory, but there was a desire to extinguish Native American land claims, and that's particularly true in the South, where you want to look at Andrew Jackson's campaigns. And also that for the most part, the North had basically eliminated Native American land claims that were impeding their progress. But in the South, there was still substantial territory that was open to settlement in Georgia all the way over to Louisiana. And then the last part you want to mention, the death of the Federalist Party in there as well. Again, you don't have to break that out into a separate paragraph. That Federalist Party's death doesn't necessarily seem like it relates to slavery, but keep in mind that most of the people who were anti-slavery in abolitionist societies at this time and so forth were members of the Federalist Party. So that does have some impact there. All right. Louisiana Purchase, right? You want to note, first of all, that this is brand new territory that's not covered in that Northwest Ordinance. And then the big thing that you look at here is really 1820, that Missouri Compromise you want to devote considerable amount to be one of those areas where it's something important enough to actually put 2 paragraphs up there relating to the Missouri Compromise. You may, for example, want to detail the compromise itself fully in 1 paragraph and then talk about its impact in the next paragraph, right? But basically, note that this is where we see for the first time that the importance of a balance in the Senate between free and slave states, that an equal number of senators from free states and slave states be maintained, and that is something that basically holds that country together. Note that this creates an issue because it, again, is showing these divides based on geography. Missouri is a southern state, Midwestern state, but it has more of a southern culture. And of course, that's partly and largely because of slavery. But you want to note that it is more farther north than the Illinois. I mean, it's basically on par with Illinois, which is Northwest Ordinance territory and free state. So you want to note that there's, the state right next to it does not have slavery, and that it's bringing slavery farther north than it was where the pattern had it expanding towards, right? And then note that slavery gets banned north of 30, well, you can just say the southern border of Mississippi. I'm sorry, Missouri. The southern border of Mississippi is the Gulf of Mexico, so that would be a bad statement. Make sure that you know this bans slavery north of the Missouri Territory, and also note that that is only for the Louisiana Purchase. That does not apply to anything else. When you come in, we see Andrew Jackson. You have the nullification crisis. You want to take a detailed look at that. Note that it is over a tariff, right? And so it does not appear to exactly incorporate slavery, but note that this is all intertwined, that the South has that agricultural base to its economy that revolves around slavery, and slavery revolves around it. So that is a tariff that is raising their costs as purchasers of manufactured goods while not doing anything reciprocal for their agricultural products, right? But note, South Carolina is, for the first time, the southern states are discussing secession. You may, if you've done the War of 1812, mention that secession was discussed by the Federalists, right? Especially if you go into any detail about their dissolution as a party, right? This, also going back, this was actually during the Adams administration when these Madison and Jefferson's writings, Jeffersonian writings, were actually first published, the Virginia Kentucky Resolves. But the real relevance is here. They're more or less ignored back at that point. And this is where you start seeing them revived and actually brought into political discourse with that concept of nullification. Make sure you define it and define the different definitions of it. You may remember we talked about one where you just don't help enforce the law that the federal government passes, and another where you actively try to impede enforcement of federal law. Right? As you wrap up, Jackson, go into the removal policy. Again, it's not a whole lot here, but you should note again that this is freeing up a lot of that territory in the South that was Native American land so that slavery can expand into it. And this does, to a certain extent, negate the need of creating new states for a while. Right? Overall, take a look at the industrialization of the economy. You want to note that this is, despite the sectional rivalries, everyone is profiting from slavery. The North, the South, right, to some extent, the West, whether the Western state that comes out and into being is a free or a slave state, it still benefits to some extent from slavery. But you want to note that this is all, again, tied together into a national, if not international economy. The North needing the cotton to fill the raw material needs in the factories as they grow. Those demands are growing pretty rapidly, and South expanding slavery to meet that demand. Right? The cotton gin making it profitable, cheap enough to be used. And then, of course, noting that the only way to increase cotton production is to go and get more land to grow cotton. So that forces this westward expansion. So when you wrap this up, what you want to make note is even though the North, many people might be opposed to slavery, those same people are actually, through their economic needs, driving the continued expansion of slavery. So it's like they're saying, oh, we wish slavery would go away, or we're protesting force the South to get rid of slavery. But then they're like, we need to buy more cotton. And when they do that, of course, they're encouraging people to move farther and farther west and to take slavery with them in those southern states. All right, a couple of additions in there, Texas and Florida. Florida, again, is kind of like a step back chronologically, but look at it with Texas because there's a process. Florida, needed settlers, invited Americans in. American population there became threatening and looked like it could revolt and leave, so they sold it to us cheaply. Again, knocked that out with about a sentence and then turned to Texas because you see a similar process there that plays out at the end a little differently. Similar in the way they approach that, inviting Americans in. By now, of course, though, the Mexican Revolution has been successful and they're dealing with Mexico and not Spain. Note that slaves were allowed at first, but as the population of Americanos grew, they started putting restrictions in place. And you can see those bullet points there explaining some of that. Note that they, again, eventually banned slavery. And then that was one of the issues, not the only issue, but that was one of the issues that spurred the people in Texas to revolt and attempt to gain independence, which they did, right? Note that, they wanted to come in as a state, but Jackson was the president at the time, and he would not do it because he didn't want to start that war with Mexico at that point. And Texas, of course, stayed as a separate country until 44. And of course, you want to make note that it was, in fact, a slave country in that part. If you need, this is more for your understanding so that you can remember, we think of Texas as dry desert because most of the time it's depicted in Western movies and so forth. But remember the eastern part, Houston and, Beaumont, etc. Those parts of the state are very much like Louisiana, swampy, You go up in the eastern part north, it's Arkansas type climate. So this is a lot of territory that will support the cultivation of cotton. And since you mentioned Louisiana, the rice and to some extent sugar. Well, all right. This basically holds us till the Mexican-American War, which I believe is we have gotten through. Um, Basically starts with the annexation of Texas. You may want to describe that process a little bit. You may also want to discuss that campaign for Polk and his mantra, the whole concept of manifest destiny, which you see from the outline you should discuss anyway. Make sure you take these terms, and again, remember, I am just giving you like an outline, literally just an outline. These are bullet points that you need to discuss in full, so I'm not giving you the answers here. I'm telling you what you need to discuss. You need to go fill this out with significant information. But note these things very closely. Mention there's some discussion of taking all of Mexico by some Southerners, but it's too controversial. Number one, because it was believed it would open up all that land to slavery, and the North would not accept that. Discuss and define that Wilmot Proviso, manifest destiny, and at this point, how the manifest destiny trumps the desire to check slavery's expansion. Right? That D is basically just to detail what territories acquired, Texas being the only one that is going to support slavery. Right? Texas and California, you may mention that slave-based agriculture may have been feasible in California and Texas, but it would never have been feasible in the states that came out of the rest of that territory, simply because of the climate. Right? You can also note that they plan to carve up Texas into several states, which would, of course, have created 10 instead of just 2 Senate seats for the South. Shortly after this war, mentioned the California Gold Rush, right? Perhaps is driving this, but that California Gold Rush basically creates the crisis that requires the Compromise of 1850. Note all the elements in there, and note that this time, unlike the Missouri Compromise, they don't hold the country together. They sharpen the divide between the various groups and actually escalate us towards eventual civil war. Right? The fugitive slave law, you should also note that this is, again, kind of detrimental to the Southern position that we're caring about states' rights and not slavery, because this was clearly something that weakened states' rights, and the South was all for it. They were the ones who promoted it, in fact. The South supports it, the North does not. Note that this creates, again, that divide. Again, most people in the North do not want to abolish slavery, but they are opposed to it. They think it's the South's duty to eventually get rid of it on their own, and it's their decision to make. But that doesn't mean that they intellectually condone slavery itself. And this basically goes right to the heart of that matter. This is forcing them to return escaped slaves, and is a much more strongly enforced, takes away the state's capacity to just not do so or to ignore that. And basically the opposite of the nullification arguments that the South usually makes. So make note of that. All right, California, meanwhile, comes in as a free state, and that does create a majority of free states for the term. Right? Notice here, this is where you want to talk about Lewis Cass and then the promotion of popular sovereignty, as the other states that form from this will come in choosing slavery or free status for themselves under this concept. And of course, popular sovereignty, make sure you define that. So as I read it, I understand that you understand what it means. Right? And note also that it is applying to everything else. All right, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Right? Note that this also picks up popular sovereignty. All right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically is basically seeing Kansas getting enough settlers to become a state. The Southern Congress people are refusing to organize unless slavery is specifically allowed. Right? Note that's different than popular sovereignty. They don't want to allow people to go in and vote to choose to be free or a slave at first. They want it to be a slave state, period. The compromise, though, applies popular sovereignty to Kansas, which does a number of things. Number one, it takes that concept, applies it back over here in this act, of course, in something farther east. By doing so, it basically gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. It is at a place, Kansas, a place where that would have been prohibited under the original Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now they're allowing popular sovereignty, which means it may or may not be free, right? Kansas, as it goes through its statehood, you also want to talk about how there was guerrilla war fighting between both sides, acts of what we would consider terrorism by both sides today as well. And that basically most of the people who are moving in to vote were trying to basically corrupt that process, move in just to change that status, many of whom had no intention of staying as actual residents of Kansas. The people do, in fact, immigrate there with the intention of becoming permanent Kansas residents. Note that they don't want slavery. In fact, you may mention that they did not even want African Americans to be allowed in the state, free or slave. Right? And then again, detail the attempt to create the constitutions, the creation of two separate constitutions under two separate legislatures. In 1857 is that kind of key year, so you want to look at Buchanan recognizing that Lecompton Constitution and Congress rejecting it, and how that basically starts the whole thing over again. Right. Then we get to the things that we have not looked at yet. We did Kansas and Nebraska the last class. You see, this is it. So really the last things that we want to look at. Dred Scott case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Right. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more detail since we haven't covered it in class yet. All right, but basically, there was an Army officer named Sanford who owned two slaves. Dred Scott was one. His wife was also a party to this case, although her name was not listed. Right. Basically, Sanford was in the Army, and he was stationed in Illinois, and he opted to bring the Scots with him as servants. Illinois, of course, was a free state. Well, he moved back later and went back home after he was done with his military service. He was back to the South. He died. He willed them to his sister, and the sister was in Missouri, so that was also a slave state. But then they sued under the argument that they actually became free the second that they crossed into Illinois, that by willingly taking his slaves across into free territory where slavery was banned under the laws of Illinois, they instantly became free. Now, they did not necessarily become citizens, but they could not be slaves if the state law banned slavery. That was their argument. This is also, again, another instance of where you can see the South was very glad with this decision, which again shows that they're concerned about slavery, not states' rights, because basically it's saying that you're able to preempt the state's law. If you really held states' rights, then the argument that as soon as you cross over and a state law says the person is free, then you would have to accept the argument free. So the South is not really strongly supporting a states' rights position here. They're actually supporting just a position that is a strong federal court decision, but it's the least democratic branch of the government. So the one where the people have no input, the states have no input. Right? So again, the fallacy of the states' rights argument is highlighted by two particular things: this fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. Right? Now, this decision, what comes out of is number one, it's considered one of, if not the worst decision the Supreme Court has made in the history of the country for a number of reasons. One of which is just its impact. Right? It is considered one of the causes of the Civil War, one of the things that continued to drive that wedge between North and South and make it irreparably damaged. Well, to make that bond irreparably damaged between the two. and driving us onto that path, which of course the Civil War starts only 3 years later, right? But it's also one that is very poor legal reasoning. And the reason I say that is because it basically completely just makes up the law the way the justices wanted it to be and not the way it actually was. So, for example, one of the main things that they said in there was, as it says, Scott could not sue because he was not part of the American people. Right? In that analysis, they basically came to the conclusion amongst the majority on the court that the Constitution and the governments that were created were essentially written for white people, and that in this case, didn't reference any other minority groups, but in this case, people of African descent could never be citizens, and therefore never part of the people, and therefore never they would not have the right to sue in a court of law. So basically, they dismissed this case, saying they didn't even have the right to be there in the first place. Right? Now they go on beyond that with their reasoning. Now the reason I say this is very fallacious. Number one, several states, pretty much every northern state after the Revolution, freed its slaves, and those people were recognized as citizens. And they voted. People in Congress, they were voting for people in Congress, and therefore those people in Congress were representing them as part of the people. Keep in mind that even in the South, free black people in North Carolina, for example, right after the Revolution, were not just recognized as citizens, but were extended the right to vote. So that was a very incorrect argument on that. The law of the country did not support it. Now, if you wanted to argue that the first, that what the founding fathers envisioned was creating a society that was basically for the Protestant white majority at the time, we still have that argument today. We still see people saying that's what, from a different context, but people are saying that's the way the system was created. It was created to keep the white power structure in place, and that's what they mean by it. It was created for the white people, but the fact is that from the very beginning, there was no prohibition on anyone else becoming a citizen. Native Americans had become citizens through process. African Americans who were freed, right, became citizens. All of those were extended to franchise in the North for a short time. Free black people in some southern states, even the one that was most, considered most intolerable to African Americans, South Carolina after the Revolution did not prevent African Americans from voting if they were free. So that was a very poor decision intellectually on the court's part. But again, they were looking for an outcome, not going through and actually looking at what the law said. They were trying to warp the law to create what they wanted, which they thought arguably was, Taney was a Southerner, so he probably thought it was the right decision. And I'm sorry, Taney was the Chief Justice who wrote the decision. But also, they wanted to basically try to stop the divisions between North and South. Instead, they increased them. All right. There was also some discussion of property in there, and that we have the Bill of Rights. And we have some provisions in there about the government, specifically Congress, not being able to take people's property without two things. First, you have to have a legitimate government purpose. And second, you have to compensate the individual. They took this to mean that in those territories where Congress legislates for the people who live in those territories, Congress actually had an affirmative duty to protect property, and therefore they could not ban slavery in any territory prior to it becoming a state, right? And what this meant, number one, was even with part of the, everything outside of Kansas still being questionable, that was no longer the case because it basically ruled the entire Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Right? And it also raised the potential that no state could force a person to give up a slave. So if you move to New York, there may not be a way to litigate for that slave's freedom. You could help the slave escape, and if you did so, you'd probably have to get that slave to Canada to really be safe. But if you were considered property at one point, then any state like freeing you by crossing over the border, the same argument would take place that you just became free, and then the state would either have to compensate the person. If they did not do that, they could not take the property, so that meant the person would still be a slave. Again, this undoes basically rules that had been in place since the beginning of the country's history, where if you were, at least willingly moving a person into a free state, then the state's laws determined the status of that person, not, in this case, arguing that the Bill of Rights protects your property, but that when you to a free state, that person, falls subject to state law, both the slave and the slave owner, whichever one you argue is the important one, and then that person becomes. Now, again, with the Constitution having a fugitive slave law provision, it did not mean that people who ran away became free when they crossed into free territory. We're looking at cases like Dred Scott, where a person took a slave with them into free territory. If they did that willingly and knowing that it was a free state, then that person would become free. And basically, if that is undone, then that really is upsetting people in the North. And people in the South, of course, are actually looking at this as a good thing, and it promotes and increases the hostility between the two regions. Right? This was going to be in place too. This is not undone until, after the Civil War. When you get to your chapter, if you haven't already gotten to it on Reconstruction, the 13th Amendment does not undo this decision. That abolishes slavery, so it undoes part of it. However, the ruling that people of African descent could not become citizens was not undone until the 14th Amendment was passed. And again, note as you go through that chapter that just because you're a citizen does not automatically qualify you to vote. Right? And it never will. I mean, if you look at our society today, if you are a convicted felon, you are often denied the right to vote. That is not determined by citizenship status. You don't lose your citizenship status when you are convicted of a felony, whether in prison or have completed your time or whatever. Similarly, if you are looking at it even more broadly, we don't let 2-year-olds vote. We presumably never will. All right, but they are in fact citizens. So citizenship does not automatically qualify people to vote. So the 15th Amendment did that. Now, voting was not an issue in this case. The two issues were the status of the slave, whether they were slave or if they had become free, and they raised the citizenship in that decision as well. But so you look at your 13th and 14th Amendment to completely undo the Dred Scott decision. It actually took 2 amendments to undo this one Supreme Court decision. Right. Again, most of us historians, constitutional historians, and would say this is one of the, if not the worst Supreme Court decision in the history of the country. I would argue it's probably the worst. Right. Of course, it's related very closely to the other candidates because many of those revolve around a race. We don't get to them yet, but Plessy versus Ferguson is one that would arguably be worse. I think this one was just so much more restricted that you couldn't even get to the point of discussing having something that was separate but equal, because Dred Scott you could have nothing. It didn't even get to that point where you were requiring anything, whether it's separate or not. So and this one basically denied everything: citizenship status, freedom, you name it, all the things that go with citizenship or potentially go with citizenship. The right to protect rights by going into court, for example, which you actually don't have to be a citizen normally to do. So that was another bad part to this decision. Saying that these people could not be citizens and therefore could not sue was also fallacious, because you can come here from a foreign country and not be a United States citizen and you can sue. A few years ago, we had the case where one of the people working in the American, I believe, embassy, or one, actually, I believe it was one of the military facilities in the UK, hit a kid and killed them on the road and then came back over here. That person would still be subject to being sued by their parents in the U.S. courts. You do not have to be a citizen to bring a suit, but they banned those suits by African Americans. So that was about as egregious a decision as you could reach, and probably not likely to be outdone from how bad it was. All right. As you can see, that pretty much brings us to the end here. I think there are some, I think the outlines in some of the classes made reference to Crittenden Compromise, which is actually, you don't have to do the Crittenden Compromise. That's technically after secession has already started, so I would not encourage you to even tackle that subject. I'm gonna come back over here to the Blackboard screen and see who we got left. Oh, we've actually increased a little. And so I see we got one question already coming in. All right. Okay, this is good. I'll address this from Kaylee Ryman. I think I got two Kayleys here. I don't know if I've got them in class today. But it is, yes, due on the 6th, next Monday, by 11:59 p.m. Right? I believe there's one person who had a trouble with their research paper submission. They tried to, it does count it to the second. They tried to submit and they were denied because they were 11:59 and 20 seconds or something like that. So please don't wait to the very last minute to submit it. Again, I encourage you to submit through Blackboard and then email me a copy as well in case something goes wrong with Blackboard, which does happen upon occasion. All right. And as to the format, organize it in paragraphs. Aside from that, the specific format is required. You do not need to cite anything because all of this should be coming straight from your textbook, your lecture notes, and maybe you can dig up the PowerPoints for classes in the reference section, all of which is considered common knowledge. So you do not have to cite any of that. If you do some extra research, which I do not encourage you to do, I would say focus on what you're supposed to know and don't try to bring in extra stuff. That's really what I'm trying to gauge. And bringing in extra stuff and skipping stuff that you are supposed to know can hurt your grade, not help it. So make sure you focus on the materials that we are supposed to have covered. All right. I would ask that you don't just give me one long, solid block of text. Do break it up into paragraphs. I have that a few times where nobody ever hits the enter key. And when I'm grading it, it is a real pain for me to grade it. Just makes it hard to track it as I go through it. So please break it up into paragraphs. But aside from that, I don't care about format. Okay, any questions about the final? Or anything else for that matter? And while I'm waiting to see if any of those are going to come in, I'd also like to make a note that go ahead and check Blackboard. I have graded pretty much everything except that I have not gone in and entered zeros for assignments that were not completed. Right? But if you have done your research paper, let's see, U.S. history, I believe I got 2 today, so all your grades were posted probably this morning or early afternoon, and you can go in and check that grade, and what you have now should be getting pretty close to an accurate calculation of what your final grade will be. Look at your midterm grade and note what, if you're sitting at like a 69.5, then whatever you got on the midterm, you need to make that to keep your grade exactly where it is, and hopefully a little better so that you can bring it up some. All right. So we are writing about all these topics for our essay due on Monday. Yes, ma'am, that is correct. This is, pretty much everything. There might be one or two things you could add in here, but if you cover this and you do it thoroughly, which is the key, then you got yourself an A exam paper. So just follow this, touch on everything, don't skip it. I've had some people, I had one person last semester who, not last semester, I'm sorry, I think it was last year sometime, might have been last fall. But regardless, whenever it was, I had someone who did this exam with the essay. And what they did was basically um, about a paragraph of some very general stuff about slavery in the North and the South, and essentially got a 0 on it. Most people, if you're looking like a C, you might skip a few of these things, or you might just talk very briefly. And the more you put in there, the better your grade is. You've got some adequate time. I suggested basically that you take your notes on it and kind of shape those answers as we went through. So if you did that, go back through your notes and you can almost cut and paste them into the right places and maybe just change the language a little bit and be good. But you can also have plenty of time now to go through and get this done as well. Divide it out. You got a week roughly, so divide it into 7 parts and just tackle 1/7 each day, or maybe 1/6, and then give yourself a day off. Right? But it is very doable. Well, we have a DBQ or just the essay and multiple choice. I'm actually going to delete out the multiple choice. All you will have is this one essay question right here. No document-based stuff in there. If if you go through the textbook, and we've had a few primary documents in the textbook or excerpts from them. If you did something on your research paper that touches on, and you want to bring one of those documents in, feel free to do it, but you do not need to do it. Okay? All right. Well, now, let me see who I got in here. All right, I think I've got some really good students here. Y'all did great this semester. I really appreciate y'all being here every time. As you can see, it kind of shrank over the course of the semester. I think we still have probably about 15 people on the roster, which means about almost 10 people still active, but they probably just watched the recordings, and y'all were good enough to join every time and go through the class. So I really appreciate that. I hope y'all have a great to this semester. If you have trouble, if you have doubts about what you're doing, reach out to me, email me, and I'll try to help you. I can't give you the answers, obviously, but I can tell you if you're on the right track or if you need to put more information, that kind of stuff in there. And hopefully we'll see y'all in the spring. Regardless, though, y'all have a great holiday, whatever you celebrate. Have a Merry Christmas or Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate. If you celebrate, I hope you have a great time. If you don't celebrate anything, take a couple weeks off and just celebrate the fact that you're done with this semester. All right. Any other questions? Go ahead and email them to we're done, and y'all take care.